Same old man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat. So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for January 6, 2025, and I'm Jaded Duran.
And I'm Brennan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody, for this conversation as we near the end of our 2024 campaign. We are inching closer and closer. We just released our top 5 scenes of the year on episode 618 that is available right now if you want to go and check that out.
What a conversation.
We have 2 reviews this week. That was a great conversation. I very much do agree. We have 2 reviews this week. We're starting off here with Babygirl, and then we will finish off with Hard Truce, and then we will get to the In Session Film Awards this weekend in episode 619. So it's going to be a very, very busy week.
Very busy, and a perfect pairing here, because the hard truth is I call JD Babygirl behind his back.
Yeah. Well, that is very endearing. I will take that. I love being the baby girl. I do love a good glass of milk. It is quite refreshing. So I will take it.
I kind of do too.
It's very nice. If someone ordered it for me at the bar, I would equally maybe be a little jolted by it, but I would absolutely consume it because I love a good glass of milk.
A fun game to play would be, what kind of milk was that? What do we think that was? Was that,
I don't know.
Was that pure dairy? Was that almond milk? Maybe a little bit of oat milk, maybe some goat's milk? What seems to scream the relationship between Nicole Kidman and Harris Dickinson in this?
I don't know. It is a great question. And maybe the film left it ambiguous for a reason. Who knows?
That is my favorite question to ponder on this movie, is what kind of milk was it?
I don't know. Yeah, who knows? We are here to talk about Babygirl. And, I just noted that we did our top 5 scenes of 2024 on the main show this last week. And we didn't mention Babygirl in that conversation. Spoiler alert for those that haven't heard that conversation yet. We talked about many great scenes from 2024.
Yeah.
I do think there is at least one that qualifies as an honorable mention from this film that we'll talk about. So I just go ahead and throw that out there because we missed it. We missed it on the main show, but as I was doing my notes and my preparation for this conversation, I do think there's one scene here that qualifies as an honorable mention at the very least. So
I think I know what one you're talking about.
Yeah, we'll get to it. We'll certainly get to it. That is for
pretty sure everyone knows what one you're talking about.
Yeah, I think we all know. There's one standout scene.
Maybe the most basic pick from this movie, but it might be the right one.
I think sometimes, yeah. Well, I will say there is a second scene here that I do think is quite noteworthy, and maybe that is the more subtle one. It is the moment in the film that might be least talked about, but I really liked. We'll get to that as well.
Curious what you think that is.
So before we get into Babygirl, I do want to ask you about Halina Reijn. Did you get a chance to see Bodies, Bodies, Bodies a few years ago?
I did not. So this is my introduction to Halina Reijn.
Yeah. So I wanted to note that as well. I do know that Bodies, Bodies, Bodies was getting some decent praise from our peers and friends. Yeah. However, it came out at a time where it was very busy for me. I had other priorities that I wanted to catch up with, and it slipped through the cracks. I just did not get a chance to.
When exactly did that one come out? I know that was that was a 2023 film, if I'm not mistaken, but I think I'm trying to remember exactly what month it was, because that may have been around the time where I was seeing less films in preparation for my wedding.
I'm fairly certain that it was in the fall. I want to say maybe late August, early September, mid-September.
That could explain it. Yeah.
Somewhere around there.
Yeah. That would explain
at the time, I just had different priorities. And as the fall goes, as we all know, it gets crazier and crazier and crazier as award season ramps up. And it was just one of those I just never got around to. Even after we did the award show last year.
Oh, this was
never did catch.
This was 2022. Actually, I thought it was.
Yeah, it was the fall of 2022. Yeah.
Okay, so so then I can't play the wedding excuse then.
No. Yeah. So yeah, I can't really. Yeah, I had a VOD release in September of 2022, and just never got around to it. It just came out at a time where things got busy for me.
It seemed to spark a lot of conversation. So
yeah,
I guess if there's anything to be said about Halina Reijn right now, is that her movies do spark a dialogue.
They do. Yeah. So I can't really, I can't speak to bodies. I have no clue. I can't judge it in any way, shape, or form, other than to say that some friends of ours, they did really like it. There have been notable films thrown at bodies as far as influences go that intrigues me. It does intrigue me. So it's a film I do want to catch up with, especially now that I've seen Babygirl. I am curious at the very least. So maybe once we get through this campaign, I will eventually get to that. At any rate, that is to say, Babygirl is our first exposure to Halina Reijn.
Yeah.
All right. With that said, shall we go ahead and jump into this?
Yeah, let's do this. Let's do our best.
Okay. All right. So Babygirl is, of course, directed by Halina Reijn. It is written by Halina Reijn as well. It stars the great Nicole Kidman, as well as Harris Dickinson, Sophie Wilde, and Antonio Banderas, who we love and cherish as well.
I love Antonio Banderas.
Oh, he's the greatest. All right. Yeah. If you're not familiar with Babygirl, a high-powered CEO puts her career and family on the line when she begins a torrent of air with her much younger intern. Dun dun dun.
Hey man, your plot synopsis speeches here have become more animated by the day. This one kind of requires it, so I'll certainly give it to you on this one.
I appreciate it. Look, I do know that tonally it's a little bit different, but as I read that synopsis, when you just read it on paper, I think it can vary from the film tonally speaking, because as I was reading it, I heard the score from May December in my head, and I was like, man, this just feels appropriate.
I think that's a fair comparison. I will say there's another film from this year that we never gave a full review to that I think is even more comparable to something like May December that I just got finished watching. That movie being The Room Next Door, the Pedro Almodovar film, is straight up May December in its own respective way. But maybe there's a little bit of May December sprinklings here and Babygirl as well. We might talk about that.
We'll get to it. All right, Brendan, what did you think about Babygirl?
I'm kind of stumped by this one, if I'm being honest. This might be one of those conversations where I find my thoughts as we talk about it further. At this point right now, I'm pretty mixed on the film, but I am willing to hear different sides, especially knowing that we might not be the experts in the material that's being covered here. And I'm willing to admit that at least. I might be a little bit ignorant to what Halina Reijn is trying to go for, even though I have seen some interviews of what she said she wanted to, I guess, voice with regard to this film that I do think is pretty interesting. And we may talk about that a little bit further. The thing with Babygirl for me is it kind of takes me back to a review that you and I had earlier this year that you and I had a little bit of disparity on. And that was Luca Guadagnino's Challengers, a film that we both really liked overall, but I did like it more than you. And your biggest reservation for that film is that you felt like the film could have pushed its sensual boundaries even further. I kind of felt that way about Babygirl. I actually think this is a film that's being talked about a lot for its sexuality, for how explicit that it is. And I felt like it was kind of pulling its punches. I feel like it. Okay. Yeah, I think there is at least one or two moments, and I'm sure we'll talk about, where it does get very knowingly explicit. But I felt like maybe the film was a little bit too tame by the standards I kept being told about. So it could be a hype thing that I'm willing to admit.
Okay.
It could also be maybe just my ignorance to the material and what it's ultimately going for. It could also be due to the fact that no one in this movie acts like an actual human being. I don't know if that's intentional or not. I wrote on Letterboxd that if this is secretly some kind of sci-fi film about AI discovering BDSM, then it might be the best movie of the year.
That's so funny.
And think about it, because Nicole Kidman's character of Romy, I believe her name is, she runs a robotics company.
She does.
So
AI is kind of a big part of the film. It really is.
It very much is. There is a symbolic purpose to it. But I seriously thought everyone here was a robot. I really did, especially Harris Dickinson here. You can't convince me that Samuel's not a robot. I genuinely believe that. And I don't know if that's intentional. I actually find that kind of interesting, and maybe given what Halina Reijn is trying to suggest about the film thematically, which I won't get into yet, I'll save that for later in the conversation. I do think maybe there's an interesting idea in its notions on the generational divide between sexuality, which is perhaps pretty intriguing, and maybe the coldness that comes with that. So I don't know. I'm a little stumped by this movie. Yeah. I don't think it's as risque as some have led it on to believe. And I don't know if it's because of some of these weird performance choices. Maybe it has to do with some of the conveniences in the script writing, which I think there are a lot of. And I do think the film has a hard time overcoming some of those things. So, yeah, I'm a little torn on this one. I'm curious to see where this conversation goes.
I am as well. And I do hope that people listening to this that loved it don't tune us out, because I think there is a really fascinating conversation to be had here. And I would be curious to hear further from those that did love it and how your thoughts may push back against ours, or how they intertwine with our thoughts here.
Yeah.
Because this is a really fascinating film to talk about, but ultimately I am with you in the sense that I do like this film, but I don't love it. I am mixed on it. Where we might have some disparity, though, is I did find the film quite spicy at times. At least when it is engaging in its sexuality, I did find it rather spicy. I mean, the opening overhead shot of Antonio Banderas that slowly rotates as Rami and Jacob are going at it, I think is quite the tone setter, especially as it finishes, pun intended, with Rami going to a different room to, let's say, take care of her needs. And that close up of her face as she covers her mouth to keep her moaning from echoing throughout the house, I think is a really nice touch. That is one hell of a way to open your movie. And that sexual sizzling does not evaporate as the film unfolds, at least for me. Once Samuel gets involved, things escalate pretty quickly. There's a montage of sexual encounters that erupts almost immediately. That hotel sequence that everyone is talking about in regards to this film, I do think is remarkably titillating.
That's the one.
We'll for sure talk about it as the conversation goes. It is extremely memorable. There is a vivid eroticism to the film that I do think is quite provocative and stirring, but it's obviously more than just a series of sex scenes. Thematically speaking, it's a wonderfully playful examination of power dynamics and sexual desire, something that is born out of sexual disconnect and loneliness. The film is as much a sexual coming of age movie as it is about power and desire, which is why I love how the film crystallizes in the end, because it's about those two things coming together. It's Rami's sexual cravings mixing with the detachment she's always felt with her husband. And I do love how that plays out. However, while I do admire that about the film, I don't always love the writing here, especially the writing of Samuel. I do agree with you there. It is very raw and thinly veiled. You can really see the mechanics of the film operating on the surface when he's involved. To me, and honestly, I think this is complementary to what you said in your opening thoughts. He feels more like a plot device than he does a fully realized character.
I agree.
I never saw Samuel's humanity. Maybe he is an AI robot. I don't know. But either way, he's really just a MacGuffin for the film to prop up its eroticism. I love what the film is aiming for, and its blistering eroticism is great, but there are weird gaps in the screenplay that left something to be desired for me. Nicole Kidman is really great here, though. She is stunning and a deeply committed and striking
She's very committed
performance.
for sure.
I love Antonio Banderas. I think he's really great. There's a few moments here I want to talk about with his character as well. And Dickinson, I think, does his damnedest to, again, evoke that eroticism with his character. I do think the writing limits his performance because there's not much humanity to that character. He is a plot device for the sexual tension of the film, which at times is really, really gripping, as we'll get to that hotel sequence. But I don't know. I mean, there is something about, as you put it, the lack of humanity here, that these characters operate on some sort of mechanical level and not much beyond that. At times it does. At times it does. But yeah, I don't know. There's just something about the writing here that just felt a little off to me. Just felt a little off.
Yeah, I think Antonio Banderas might be the MVP for me, but that's only because he's the only character here that feels even remotely close to being human by comparison. And I don't know if that is intentional. And I, as you were talking, I was trying to pull up this interview that Halina Reijn gave. I don't know exactly what source it was with. I think it was during many of her interviews during TIFF, where the film was in circulation, and she was talking about wanting to explore the gap between Gen Z and Gen X specifically, as it explores how each generation navigates sexuality, femininity, and identity in different ways, with Gen Z being much more comfortable with all of this. And I'm paraphrasing some of the things that she was saying.
Wait, hold on.
Yeah.
Before you continue there, are we sure about that? Isn't Gen Z the one pushing back against sex in films?
Well,
isn't that where we're at right now?
I think this is why her viewpoint and maybe her agenda with this movie is fascinating, because of how much it contradicts with what you're talking about there.
I just don't see that in reality. Perhaps her experiences are different than mine. That it certainly could be the case.
Maybe.
But when I see Gen Z on social media and sex is a talking point, especially when it comes to art, they're the ones leading the charge in terms of removing sexuality from art.
Yeah. Even so, if that is Halina Reijn's agenda with this, it does maybe explain a little bit as to why Samuel is as quote unquote robotic as he is, because he might be too comfortable with those with those notions of how he and his generation are exploring sexuality, to the point that you can almost argue he's very predatorial towards Romy in this movie. And maybe being over comfortable is something that Halina Reijn wanted to explore. Yet at the same time, I think it is a fascinating notion, given what you're talking about. Is there truth in that idea? At least as it relates to that generational gap today. I think it is a fascinating question. But the thing is, though, does that make it a forgivable thing to explore in a movie like this, when I think it's ultimately kind of wrong? I don't know. But this is where I think you hit the nail on the head by saying this is a movie that's more interesting for people like us to talk about than it was to maybe sit through. Because I think that there are gaps in the writing and in the filmmaking to get to those points. But I feel like those gaps in performance, in writing, those conveniences we talked about to get to those specific points, they feel so manufactured that I couldn't help but call this a sci-fi film. It has a robotic quality even in the filmmaking and its overall execution.
I do agree. If that was top of mind for Reijn as she was making this, and I did not hear that quote coming into this conversation, that is new to me. But if that was top of mind for her, I do find those ideas, or that idea specifically, quite fabricated here. I did not sense that at all when watching this film. And perhaps it comes down to, as you're noting, Samuel is lacking depth and nuance here. I did not sense any humanity to that character. Much of him here is awfully contrived. And the ambiguity of the character, there is a mystery to him that is somewhat interesting, but the film doesn't really follow through on doing anything with it to make it fully realized in the end. And as a result, he just seems like, I hate to keep coming back to this, but he does feel like a robot. He just feels like a pawn for the film, for the plotting to use, so that way Romy has a cipher for her self-discovery. And that to me is where I did find this film interesting. I did not find Romy nearly as robotic. I did really like that character here, because
there's more of an arc to her.
There's so much more to her character. And Nicole Kidman's performance again is quite striking. I do think the film, while it is exploring ideas of sexuality and power dynamics, it is equally this riveting examination of vulnerability and radical self-discovery. Romy, as we see, has never been able to articulate her fears and sexual desires. And through Samuel, again, as a cipher for her self-discovery, she is able to find freedom through, as one character puts it near the end, quote, shared learning, compassion, and true connection, end quote. And that is honestly the beating heart of this film. Romy's evolution has to come through others. It's Samuel taking her on her sexual journey because her husband, Jacob, was never able to. There is certainly a true connection there between Romy and Samuel in that regard. And on the other side of it, Jacob has to show compassion and understanding because he was one of the major culprits. It doesn't excuse Romy's behavior, and she is aware of that, but that's why it becomes a shared learning experience for the both of them, rendering a truer connection between them in those final scenes. I do really like how those ideas come together in the film, the bookends, and how those help heighten that thematic through line here, I think is really great. I noted in my opening thoughts the opening shot of the film, and it certainly sets the tone in terms of its eroticism, but on a thematic level, it also dictates the disconnect in terms of their sexual connection. And the final scene of the film has completely flipped that table, which I think is really great. Like from a filmmaking perspective, from a character perspective, for both Romy and Jacob, I do really like that. I think those characters have depth here, have nuance, and as far as radical self-discovery goes, and again, funneling that through shared learning and compassion and true connection, a line that tethers to Romy's workspace. Maybe we can get to that as well, how all of that is connected. But I think that's where this film is at its strongest. In terms of getting us from A to B to C, it is quite uneven. It is messy.
I agree.
A little disjointed. However, I think there's something about Banderas and Kidman's performances and the honesty that they bring here and the conviction they bring to all of this, that despite those hurdles narratively or those gaps, I still think there's something compelling to watch in those moments. But also, as we noted, like the conversation in the aftermath of watching this, it's really interesting to have those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in that dynamic there specifically between Kidman and Banderas, and how it feels like this movie about sexual discovery, or as you put it, a sexual coming of age film in many ways for two adults who arguably have come of age at least once or twice in their lives already. I think that's where the film is at its most fascinating, to the point that some of its other ideas on sexual dominance and how that tailors into the workforce and females in the workforce specifically, they almost feel like kind of like an afterthought to me, because some of these other ideas I think are more fascinating, but I think that's more so to do with the messy writing than it does the topicality of those individual ideas, which I think are worth exploring. I just don't know if the synergy is there to make it all feel like they're of a piece with one another. I think if anything, the film feels most interested in those ideas that you're talking about as this movie about sexual discovery. And maybe it's here that I would put a little bit more stock in what Halina Reijn was talking about in some of those interviews about that generational gap, and maybe how this is perhaps a woman that feels like she was sexually closeted for a while, that needs to discover new things, and ultimately how maybe it's okay to explore a few new kinks, if you will. This is a movie that I think is maybe suggesting I guess the new framework or the new landscape of people wanting to explore some of these new sexual desires and these new sexual things, which is what Samuel represents as really just a cipher, like we keep talking about. But as this journey of sexual discovery from Romy's perspective, I do think that is maybe where the film is at its most fascinating. I do agree.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I did really appreciate that about the film, the radical self-discovery that Romy has here. And I think Nicole Kidman does bring a sincere vulnerability to the character that makes sense of her choices. Even if we don't agree with them morally, you do understand why she succumbs to those desires, because as we find out in those earlier scenes, she's never had an orgasm with her husband. That is something that we know to be true about her. And she's never voiced that to Jacob either. So we do know that there's a disconnect there. How that relates to Samuel and his involvement, as much as I understand Romy's desires and how why she would succumb to them, the way in which Samuel gets involved, I just can't help but be frustrated by. Like, it just feels a little tepid in execution, and it seemingly comes out of nowhere. He shows up in the film. There's
It's an AI
explanation.
film. It's an AI film. It has to be, because even when he's introduced, you hear all of this technological mumbo jumbo in the background, whether it be cell phones or crosswalk voices. There's a lot of technological insertions in this movie as Samuel kind of makes his way through the narrative that I kind of have to feel like he is deliberately some type of system or something.
And look, if he's meant to be some sort of symbolic gesture instead of a fully realized character, I'm certainly willing to hear that argument. I don't know if that works for the film, but I'm certainly willing to hear the argument. But the moment he's introduced, and I agree with you, it is quite messy in terms of his involvement with the company and the fact that his interactions with Romy, who, as we noted earlier, is the CEO of this, what is seemingly a major company in the AI robotic industry, he just simply walks up to her, acts as if he owns the place, and she's just okay with it. Like, and then he begins to act out almost immediately from the moment that the two meet. He begins to act out with some sort of brazen dominance. How on earth he is supposed to know that information about Romy is like, it just feels like there's a lot on the cutting room floor that we don't know. Like, there's so much
because he's a robot. He's a robot.
But even as a robot, it feels like he's an all-knowing robot. Like, he's a godlike robot.
He's omniscient, right? He's all-knowing.
He's omniscient. Like, it feels like he's Jesus. Like, he could tap into her mind. Like that, and that to me, I think, is what's a little weird. For me, it took a while to come around to that specific dynamic because it felt so fabricated in terms of their involvement. And again, I don't know if that's because of that's just how the writing is, and it's a little bit lazy in that regard in terms of setting up that specific dynamic, or if there is a lot that was cut in the editing room to make sense of that relationship. Either way, the moment we see Samuel, he's immediately acting out and she's succumbing to it. And the artificiality of that specific dynamic, it does undermine a little bit of that sexual tension for me to begin with. Now, once we get to the hotel scene, and we can certainly talk about that further here, that's where I was simply able to lay down my reservations and just go with the film, because I do think from a filmmaking perspective and a performance perspective, that scene is really excellent. I think it's fantastic. But leading up to that moment, I struggled to engage with the film and its dynamics as much as I like Rami as a character. And again, the vulnerability that she displays and the power of self-discovery, especially from a sexual perspective. I really like that here, but it admittedly took to the hotel scene for me to kind of come on board with the film.
Yeah, to kind of connect with it. It's a movie that feels like it was built around that centerpiece, right?
Yeah.
It's almost as if that was the nucleus of making this movie, and then we needed a movie to surround it to actually complete the package. Because I do think that scene feels almost like the not even just the thesis, it feels like the elevator pitch for this movie in many ways.
It's like they shot that separately as a short film, and the producers were like, that is awesome. Can we make a movie around it? And they did their best to do so. That's kind of how it feels. Yeah.
I will say, I do like the way the film concludes. There's a scene involving all three of our characters in the same room.
I want to talk about that too.
I figured that was the other scene you were alluding to that's more quote unquote subtle, because I think that might be the best scene in the movie that at least brings some things together that I can at least appreciate the journey getting there, and made me think, okay, we're at least tying up some loose ends as if that this was all intentional, but it does feel a little too late when you look at the film as a whole. But I do think that centerpiece is pretty effective, primarily because it's the first time that it doesn't just get sexually explicit, which is something I was admittedly waiting for, but it also lingers on certain things, even though it's lingering on things that might be kind of implied and not fully shown to us. There's enough information to decipher what is happening, and the camera chooses to linger on reaction shots, facial reactions, that you can kind of ultimately feel and sense every explicit act that is happening on screen. So I think the filmmaking there is where it also comes together, and everything just seems to coalesce for a moment.
Yeah, I love that hotel scene. I think it is quite remarkable. And as I noted earlier, as we've been talking about, I don't love the writing of Samuel. But what's really great about this scene, aside from its striking sexuality, is that I do think it is one of the few moments where we get at least some insight into Samuel, that maybe he isn't wholly robotic. Because initially, as Romy slightly pushes back, he is confused at her annoyance, which is understandable, as there was never any line drawn as to what their relationship actually is to this point in the film. So he's not sure if Rami's vexation of him is genuine, or if this pushback that she is displaying is that part of the game that they're playing. There is a cloud of uncertainty there that does toy with power and who's actually in charge. Something that does quickly remedy itself once Rami expresses some concern about hurting Samuel, and he rebuttals with, well, I'm the one that has power over you, where he reiterates that one phone call and she would lose everything. An idea that becomes a turn on for her. But there's still some murkiness to the moment, because soon after they start wrestling with each other until Samuel vigorously subdues her. He's not violent with her, but there is an uneasiness to it. So there is some really great erotic tension at play that I do think is wonderfully vivid. Again, I love the ambiguity of what's real and what isn't. Is the tension real as both of these characters are trying to figure each other out? Or is all of this part of the game and they're both fully aware of it? I love how the film blurs those lines, especially for Samuel, as it does offer some humanity to the character for me, because it suggests when you remove the sexuality of it all, this all might be new to him too. And he's kind of making it up as it goes.
Yeah. I saw it as two different ways that it could be read, and I think they play into what you're talking about there, because on one hand, it's almost like that uncertainty is part of the game, as if it's something that's a turn on for both of them, which is a pretty interesting idea. Or maybe it goes back to those ideas on the generational divide and why Samuel seems so confused that someone who is a Gen Xer would be so turned off by all of this. He's probably thinking, wait, isn't this something you guys like? So maybe that confusion is actually part of that generational divide. So it's interesting how how I feel like everything that's working in the movie's favor is all funneled within this scene. It really is a good short film in a movie that didn't need to be a full-length movie.
And that's a really great point. I didn't really think about that, but you are right in terms of the power dynamic at play. Who's really in charge? There is the practical, you're cheating on your husband. I have the power, as he brings up. As
you have something to lose.
You have something to lose here. But in terms of sexual discovery, you're right in terms of which generation thinks that this is their thing or not. Like that could kind of go both ways as well. Sure. So like that certainly adds to the conversation. And then there's the uneasiness of it as they're wrestling around. Is he going to get violent? Is this going to go beyond a certain line? Like it kind of rides that line as well. Now, again, he doesn't get violent. He does subdue her, but he doesn't cross any sort of line.
Yeah. Consensual is what he says.
It's very consensual. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So again, I love how it is blurring those lines. It is murky. And from Samuel's perspective, I think all of this is important because it really is the first time in the film where he doesn't seem as if he has all the answers. He's not fully dominant. He's also trying to figure this out alongside Rami. So like, I do love those nuances here. And then as you get to the actual sexuality of the moment, it does become one of the more visceral sex scenes we've seen in a long time. That close-up on Kidman is nothing short of exhilarating. She is a movie star for a reason, and the way she holds that moment, giving credence to Rami's pleasure and uncertainty simultaneously, is astounding. The orgasm moment is something to behold. But again, circling back to the nuances of what's at play here, once she does have the orgasm, there is an immediate tsunami of guilt that she experiences as the scene comes to a close. So it's quite remarkable how it begins with uncertainty. It ends with this a wave of grief in the character, but obviously the middle of it is full of sexual tension and discovery and satisfaction. And yeah, I mean, there is so much happening in just this one moment. It is, as you put it, it's an incredible short film inside of this movie.
Is.
It's phenomenal.
And the rest is kind of fluff, or I guess better term, the rest is kind of milk. Right? The rest is just kind of milking it. Just milking it. Actually, the more we talk about this, the more I realize what milk that actually was. We were joking about what kind of milk it is. It's not milk at all. I bet that's the fluid that makes the androids run in the alien universe.
There you go. He just took that right out of his own system.
We're just gonna call him like Ash from here on out.
Yeah, I mean, he does feel like a little Ash-like. He kind of does.
He is very ashy. Yeah.
Well, and I guess that kind of circles to the end of the film as well, in some ways, because there is that moment between the three of them. And I do want to talk about what happens between the three, but since we're talking about Samuel and the mystery of him, it's kind of funny to me how that whole sequence crystallizes and then he's just gone, like just disappears. We don't know where he went. We don't know what happens to him. He just leaves. Like he just walks away from the movie.
It's a simulation.
Like, exactly. Like it does feel that way. It's like, just like Siri just leaving you. Like that's, it's more her-like than it is Babygirl.
Yeah, Siri has developed some real physical attachments to its human counterparts. I'll say that.
Yeah. Okay. I do want to talk about that scene though between the three of them because I do find it quite riveting. And while I recognize that Nicole Kidman's performance here is really terrific, it is fantastic. If she goes on to be nominated at the Oscars, I'm not gonna push back at all. She really
I
is
get it.
quite
Yeah, I get it.
tantalizing here.
Yeah.
I think she's really great. Now, to your point, I think I do slightly prefer Banderas here. And I think it's because he is the only character from beginning to end that feels grounded in some sort of reality that we can recognize.
Mm-hmm.
And he is imperfect. He does make mistakes.
Yeah.
But I think what's interesting is that his mistakes are born out of a realism that a lot of people do experience in terms of their obliviousness. He clearly isn't doing it maliciously. He just doesn't understand. So again, there is a disconnect, but that also circles back to Rami and how she's unable to articulate this to Jacob. That is a flaw in Rami as well. So she just begins to act out on it instead of trying to figure it out with Jacob. And that comes to a head, obviously, at the end of this film when, spoiler alert, I guess, spoiler alert for the end of Babygirl. But there comes a moment where the three of them have a hashing out of what's at play. Jacob, comes to understand what is happening between Rami and Samuel.
Yeah.
And it leads to this physical altercation between Samuel and Jacob near the end of the film that crystallizes in this really interesting way where Jacob has a panic attack, and how he comes down from that panic attack, that moment between Jacob and Samuel, is the other moment for me in this film. Honestly, might be my favorite moment in the movie. And again,
I agree with that.
How it maintains the mystery of Samuel, I think it does that because there's nothing to explain how he would approach Jacob in that moment. It's just something that happens. But I don't find it robotic, and maybe this speaks to Dickinson's performance. It felt like a humanistic gesture, a moment of compassion. And again, going back to that line of dialogue I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the film's thematic nucleus, and there's this speech that the Esme character gives at the end when talking about Rami. It relates to the work environment where she says that the company is about shared learning, compassion, and true connection. That is a line that I think is very much at the core of this scene between the three of them that I think is really, really fascinating. And there's something about the tenderness of how that plays out that I just did not expect. Like, I think the film wonderfully subverts tonally in that way that I think is really touching. And again, it offers some great insight to Samuel that outside of the hotel scene, we just really hadn't seen yet.
Oh, yeah. This movie is, without a doubt, Spike Jonze's Her. Absolutely is.
Yeah.
Because that's essentially what the ending of the movie is getting at in some ways. The notion that you could be tied to AI as sort of a failsafe or a security blanket until it starts to understand human emotions in its own way, but nothing can actually take over or beat genuine human connection, which is essentially what this conclusion is kind of getting at. So perhaps, this is where Samuel takes on the Samantha character. We got two Sams here. So how convenient is that? I do agree with what you're saying, though, as far as the importance of recognizing human connection in that moment as being perhaps the thing you just can't disregard. That ultimately makes us less human. Even despite the film recognizing that generational divides in our explorations of sexuality can ultimately be different, and that's okay. It could be consensual, and that's also okay. But nothing can take away from human connection, and that's where I think, that connection there between Sam and Jacob is very touching, surprisingly. But I just have to joke and make the comparisons to Her once again because it's pretty striking how similar that they are thematically.
It really is, but I do really love that scene between the three of them at the end. I think partially because, not just because it's tender and poignant, and it is all of that, but subversive in the sense that in a lot of other movies, that's just not how that scene plays out. I do love how the connective tissue of this film, again, goes back to compassion, shared learning, and true connection. And how that is interwoven to that moment between not just Rami and Jacob or Rami and Samuel, but Jacob and Samuel as well. Like there is a connection they have when he's having that panic attack, a true one that allows Jacob to calm himself back to reality. And again, and it's not just connection, it's compassion. He's showing compassion there in that moment as well. And it leads to a shared learning for Jacob as he's able to discover something new about his wife that he did not know previously, that as the film begins to end, we see that he is engaging in that learning experience himself as well. And perhaps if we were to see the film continue as Rami and Jacob begin this new sexual adventure together, there's probably going to be a level of self-discovery for Jacob as well that the film kind of infers, or like kind of leaves that hanging as a possibility for him.
Yeah. There's more for their respective journeys. And I will say, I also do like the way that Halina Reijn plays with sexual tension in that moment when Jacob is suffering a panic attack, because there's a visual cue or a gesture between Jacob and Samuel that I think is there deliberately to trick the audience into thinking, oh, they're about to kiss, aren't they? It does kind of play with that a little bit. I don't know if that was intentional. I say that it was, but I don't know if it was. It's almost as if to suggest that Jacob's arc is just beginning in exploring new sexual urges or new curiosities that he hasn't explored yet either. So to your point, maybe that door is slightly ajar by the end, and I'm curious to see where their journey goes, and I don't know where that journey might go.
See, that's really interesting because that was not my interpretation of the moment, but circling back to what we said earlier in terms of opening this up for those that have seen the film listening to this, and I assume most, if not all of you, have seen the film. I'd be curious. Maybe more people agree with you than
maybe I'm alone in that.
But I don't really know. I will say that was not my experience watching this film. I did not experience sexual tension between the two of them. However, I am open to that interpretation. Maybe that is what the film was going for. I don't really know. However, because I think everything is funneled through, again, that three-prong mantra of learning, compassion, and connection. Like that's how I saw that moment. It was Samuel showing compassion and connection with Jacob in this very unexpected way that allows him to see through the cloud of his anger over his wife cheating on him with this man, with this young person. And he's able to sift through that cloud to come to some sort of understanding, which leads to that shared learning that comes about at the end of the film. So like everything is kind of funneled through that prism, I think. And so that's how I saw the moment, but maybe you're right. Maybe there's more to it than that, which
I'd be curious to see
certainly
what people
could
think.
lead to everything that you're saying there. Yeah, I don't really know, but either way, I think it's a great moment. I think it's fantastic, and it's. I would argue that's Dickinson's best moment in the film, even more than what we get there at the hotel scene. Even though that scene is great, like that scene is certainly the centerpiece.
It's great, but it's more Romy's scene than it is Samuel's.
It is
scene,
more Romy's scene. That is Samuel's moment in this film, I think, and it's certainly a great moment for Banderas as well. Fantastic.
Two great scenes in this movie, but I still go back to my initial feelings on the movie. I'm still mixed on the movie overall. I just don't think those two great scenes are enough to justify a nearly 2-hour film. I feel like the film is kind of spinning its wheels to get to those individually great moments that have a lot of substance within them. Just don't think the full movie is able to justify all of that.
I agree. And I think regarding some of the interweaving of the narrative here, I wish it operated a little bit more like the Esme character. I know we haven't talked about her a whole lot here, played by Sophie Wilde. And I think what's interesting about that character, she ultimately doesn't have a huge role here. However, and again, spoilers for Babygirl, there, like, throughout the film, there is this subplot of Esme wanting a promotion at the company.
Yeah.
And it's brought up a couple of times. It's not something that comes out of nowhere. At least 3 different times throughout the film, they bring it up. Can we talk about my promotion? I've worked really hard. I want this promotion. I really revere you as a leader, as a woman who made it to the top. Can we talk about this promotion? And every single time, Romy kind of brushes it off because her priority is, of course, with Samuel and that dynamic. And then, him showing up at her house unexpectedly, she gets really mad at that. And are we going to get caught? Like, there's certainly more melodrama on her plate than this promotion.
Sure.
However, there is a second time that Samuel shows up at her house, and it is the birthday party. Esme comes over as well, and she kind of walks in on them having a moment. So, like, by the time you get to the end of the film and you see Esme kind of puppeteering Romy a little bit in a similar way to what Samuel had said earlier in the film, in terms of, I can make a phone call and your whole career is done. Like, there's a similar puppeteering going on there with Esme, but I do love how she kind of takes advantage of it without antagonizing her. I did find that very interesting.
There's a weird balance between still maintaining respect, but also dominance.
Yes.
So she's almost playing that same game of dominance, just without the sexuality to
without
back
the
it up.
sexuality.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I do like how that is woven into the tapestry of the narrative, even though it might seem like it's like a weird rabbit hole, like this side quest that the film is going on that has little to do with the sexuality of the film. But it actually is important because, one, it offers, to your point, a different viewpoint on power dynamics with Romy and how that can affect relationships. But again, she becomes the beating heart of the film when she gives that speech at the end. I guess in a blunt way, she does spell out the film's themes, but through this work presentation. So it's kind of hidden.
There's enough conviction in that performance that I think it ultimately works for the most part. It's one of those cases where I feel like if it weren't for Sophie Wilde's performance, I'm not sure if I would have been able to come around on that character or how it's how she's interwoven within the film. I think Wilde does a great job making it work. I think she's really, you called her the beating heart. I think that's a pretty fair assessment as far as how she becomes the sort of the visual representation of the film's themes in many ways. But I think she sells it.
And by beating heart, I mean she delivers that speech at the end, which kind of helps decipher what this film is about. Again, going back to that line,
there's conviction there.
She opens up that speech about how it's, shared learning, compassion, and true connection. That's what this company is about. That's what this movie is. Like, that 3-pronged approach funnels itself into every section of this film. Now, of course, it is messy throughout. The writing here isn't proficient.
Yeah.
However, I think Esme and how she's involved, I do think is important because it ultimately leads to the revelation of that line, which I think from there you can see, and retroactively anyway, you can go back and see how the film was funneling through that specific prism. And again, like how she takes advantage of Romy in a way where she also shows dominance, obviously not sexually, but showing dominance to her that Romy kind of respects in a way. Like she kind of comes out on the other side, a different person.
And then kind of plays the same game to someone else.
And then plays at the very end. Yeah. Again, going back to self-discovery and living, in terms of freedom, like having a free identity.
Sure. Yeah.
So like, again, I do think there's a sincerity to the film in that regard that I do think is really great. in terms of opening up conversations on sexuality and, the different mechanisms that turn people on. And sometimes it might be in unexpected ways, like someone giving you milk at a bar, which the director here, Halina Reijn, has said that actually happened to her, which is why it's in the film.
That's hilarious. That's hilarious.
Yeah.
Or scary. Maybe hilarious is the wrong word, but maybe kind of creepy. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what her thoughts are on the subject.
She talked about it being a turn on for her, which is why it is kind of in the film. So
then hilarious. I'll stick with that.
Yeah, like yeah. So in terms of exploring sex in that way, I did find the film interesting. It's just messy and getting from A to Z. That's kind of my only thing. Like I was quite compelled by what the film was going for. I just didn't love the execution. A lot of words to say that, I guess.
Yeah, and I'm with you completely.
The last thing I'll note here, the music by Cristobal Tapia de Ver. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but I really like the score here. I think the score is kind of an underrated component to this film as well.
Yeah,
it's really quite intriguing.
Good soundtrack
and
too. Some good needle drops here as well.
Yeah, good stuff. Okay, so that is Babygirl. If you agree or disagree with anything we had to say, you can leave a comment below if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, reach out to us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, Letterboxd. You can always email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com.
And I'm actually pretty proud of us on this, Judy, because we went through this whole conversation on Babygirl. We did not even once bring up Eyes Wide Shut.
Oh, yeah. This is a spiritual sequel to Eyes Wide Shut.
I know everyone's been saying it. We didn't even say it yet.
Well, and I think what's interesting, although this doesn't necessarily correlate to Eyes Wide Shut, but when thinking about the sexuality of this film, and certainly there is, it is a spiritual sequel to Eyes Wide Shut in a lot of ways. But I think what's also fascinating about this film in terms of its sexuality is that there's really not a whole lot of nudity here.
No,
there's a lot of sexuality to the film, and I thought it was quite tantalizing when the film is emphasizing it. In the back half of the film, it's more about the melodrama than the sexual tension of the film. So it does kind of disappear for a while. But when it's there, I do think it's operating in a really great way. And they don't get naked. But it's still like that sexuality is still palpable.
It's still very implied.
It's still, it's still great. So, at any rate, I enjoyed that element of it. But yeah, I'm proud of us. Didn't even bring up Kubrick at all.
Because I know everyone's been doing it. So hopefully we're allowed to, find ourselves standing out from the crowd and doing so. Yeah,
for sure. I always, when we do these reviews, we're always invoking other films and influences, but it's not my immediate go-to because I like to talk about the film and how it's operating on its own terms. But a lot of the time it's hard to distinguish.
There's sometimes you can't escape the comparison.
You can't escape it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, a lot of the times when we do it, we're doing it complimentary. When I talk about The Wild Robot and how I think of Midnight Special, for example, I'm doing that as a compliment.
Or a way of trying to articulate our thoughts a little bit better by making
exactly.
Yeah. So it's really more for us than it is on the film.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. At any rate, that is Babygirl. Let us know how you agree. If you disagree, we would love to know what you think. Stay tuned for our next review. We're going to be talking about Hard Truths, and that'll be our last review of the 2024 campaign. Perhaps on the other side of the In Session Film Award show, we might get to a few late films that have been trickling out. Because January doesn't always have the greatest of movies to talk about. So,
I don't know. I'm kind of looking forward to Den of Thieves too.
Oh, yeah, I am too. No. Don't get me wrong. I am as well, for sure. But generally speaking, January and February can leave something to be desired. We'll see. I haven't had too much time to look at 2025 quite yet. But it's always possible we get back to some more 2024 films in the next few weeks. But that is to say, technically speaking, Hard Truths will be our last review of the 2024 campaign. And then we'll get to the In Session Film Awards this weekend, episode 619. Be on the lookout. It's going to be a lot of fun. It's one of my favorite shows that we do each year, and it's going to be great. I cannot wait to bring Dave on. I don't know about you, but I've been looking through all my nominees. I feel like I've been changing them back, and doing that whole thing.
I'm at a point where I have to stop overthinking it.
Yeah, same. And it's interesting because like I feel like I have like a conclusive list on a certain category, and then I hear people talking about other nominees, and then all of a sudden it's like it opens the floodgates to be like, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I shouldn't include this person or that nominee or whatever.
Sometimes I just wish that we would just do a top 10 of the year and that's it, because I feel good about my top 10 right now.
I agree. I agree. My 10 has been set for quite some time. My 11 through 20 has shifted slightly, so I'm kind of working there, but I don't see my 10 changing. My 10 won't change.
I think I'm with you. I may try to squeeze in a few films I haven't seen yet. There's a small handful of foreign language films I want to try to squeeze in, but I'm having a hard time believing any one of them will change my top 10 at this point. I just feel I feel a particular passion about my current top 10 that I think it's going to hold pretty true.
Okay. Well, I can't wait to see Monte Cristo crack your top 10 once you finally realize your wrongdoings.
It's number 0 right now. It's even above number 1.
Anyway, Brendan will always be wrong about that movie.
It's okay.
I do look forward to getting into the top 10. And look, Brendan is right. Trying to get our nominees for the award show, and there's 19 categories. There's a lot that goes into it.
Oh yeah, we got to fly through. It is
a lot of fun.
We got to fly through.
Admittedly, a lot of fun. Yeah, I do really enjoy the process. Even if it is overwhelming, and sometimes you pull your hair out trying to figure out what it is, but I do enjoy it. I have a lot of fun with it. So.
Yeah, for sure.
At any rate, stay tuned for that. Stay tuned for Hard Truths. Go check out our best scenes of the year on this week's main show, 618. That is available right now. You can go listen to that as soon as you're done with this. With that said, thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Antonio Banderas. MVP.
Babygirl.